You know, I already got a phone call. I got a phone call about 3 weeks ago from Ben Shapiro, but it wasn't Ben Shapiro.
No.
It was someone using an AI system to modify their voice in real time using Ben Shapiro's accent and diction. And I, like, after talking to him for about a minute, I knew something was up, because the way he talked wasn't the way Ben talked, but the voice was, the cadence, everything, 100% perfect. And of course, we've already seen deep fake videos, and they're going to become extremely common. And you can imagine, how could this not be the case? You know, on the eve before a critical election, there'll be the release of some deep fake video. Of course, absolutely. You know, of a candidate in bed with someone, or God only knows doing what or saying what. And by the time we find out that it's a fake, it'll have had the effect on the election.
Yeah.
And so what are we going to do when photographs and videos can be faked with perfect fidelities? And then these AI language systems are so sophisticated that they really do pick up the essential elements of someone's thought, especially if they have a large corpus of words to work with. And I have a student, former student, he's a colleague of mine now, who's worked with large language models for years, and we've started experimenting with these sorts of things, you know, producing a virtual Nietzsche. We have a virtual King James Bible, and so you can ask the Bible any question. Yeah, I know, it's very strange. It's like, I don't even know what to think about that, because the AI system, the large language model, does capture the spirit of a text. And there's a lot of biblical text. And now if you have a system that speaks, what voice is a system that speaks in the voice of the Bible? What the hell voice is that? It's complicated, right? Because YouTube, the distribution of video, and the ability to store it has really transformed the communication landscape. That's why we can do this, right?
Yeah.
And it's also, and this is a very positive thing, it's taken a lot of the falseness out of media coverage. I mean, one of the things that's happening in this presidential election, which is absolutely revolutionary, and this is going to happen with increasing speed, is that the candidates are turning to the podcast world to deliver their message, to communicate with the people directly, right? And now and there's not a lot of interference with that. YouTube took down my interview with Robert F. Kennedy, which I thought was absolutely unforgivable, given that he's bloody well running for president, you know, and we're so hepped up about interference with elections from the Russians, which was all a lie, and here's actual interference with an ongoing election. But even having said that, the candidates are making the rounds on the podcast world because they're on the soapbox. It's unscripted. They don't have the questions ahead of time. It's long enough so that you can kind of get a sense of who the person is, and you cut out that television intermediary that turned everyone into, you know, a dim-witted idiot with no memory and a 30-second attention span. So that's a plus. I do think there's the market for live events is going to become larger and larger, because there's going to be a hunger to move away from the virtual into the real world, especially as the virtual becomes, if it does become more and more untrustworthy. YouTube's a complete bloody miracle that we can do what we're doing. It's a revolution. Online video is a revolution as big as the Gutenberg press, I think. You know, most people don't buy books. It's a niche market, especially hardcover nonfiction. A small number of people buy those books, and an even smaller number of people read them. And that's partly because, well, you can't read when you're driving, and you can't read when you're welding, you know? You can't read when you're plowing or harvesting a field, but you can listen. Yeah. And way more people can listen than read. Like, I think 20 times more, 50 times more, way more people can listen and watch. Yeah. And so now, you know, the printing press had the advantage of permanency and duplicatability. But now video has permanency and duplicatability. Right. So, and there's no barrier to publication, right? We can record this and put it out in front of 1 million people in like one day. Yeah. It's an utterly revolutionary technology, and it should bring, this is the upside of the downsides that we've been talking about. The human race and all the individuals that make it up have always faced an apocalyptic future. You know, everybody dies, and everyone you know is going to disappear, and like the catastrophes are coming your way. And obviously, societies face apocalyptic circumstances as well. Whole Rome disappeared, Greece disappeared, you know. The apocalypse is always there as a possibility in front of us, always. The question is, the fundamental question is, how do you deal with a radically uncertain future? And one answer is, well, you panic and you run around and you terrify everyone and you use that club of fear to beat them into submission and you tyrannize them. And you do that while simultaneously claiming that you're saving the planet. And you're not. You're just accruing power to yourself. I think tyrants use fear to obtain compliance. And then you might say, well, what's the alternative to that? Well, the alternative we're trying to put forward is, how about we offer you a good deal? It's like, here's the future you could have. It'll be one where you could get ahead, you know, where you could be autonomous, you have your freedom, where your life could be abundant, and so could the life of your children. We're pro-family and we're pro-children, and we believe that if human beings acted ethically and communicated forthrightly and aimed upward courageously, because you have to do it courageously given the possibility of the apocalypse, that there isn't a problem that we couldn't solve. We could make the desert bloom. We don't have to enter the future with fear. The fundamental goal, I would say, of the conference and our initial movements is to put forward the proposition that we could develop a vision for the future that was voluntary, positive, concrete, practical, and not naive. And so the notion would be, we're not going to close our eyes to the fact that the world's a dangerous place.
Yeah.
But we're going to say, look, if we got our act together and aimed up, there's no limit to what we could accomplish. I mean, look, already in the since the wall fell in 1989, the planet has got immeasurably richer. You know, when I was a kid, the notion of starvation in China and India and Africa, that was par for the course. That was happening all the time. That doesn't happen anymore. People only starve now for political reasons, and very rarely. And that's despite the fact that there are 8 billion people on the planet, when the doomsaying apocalypse mongers in the 1960s believed that we would be overpopulated and starving at 4 billion by the year 2000. See, human beings are strange creatures because we evolved the ability to produce virtual representations of ourselves. That's what a thought is. You know, when you dream of yourself or you dream of another person, you've made an avatar of yourself or the other person in imagination, right? It's virtual. A thought is a virtual extension of you. Okay, so what human beings do is they produce thoughts that multiply, and all the ones that aren't useful die. Well, then the people don't have to die. And so we've substituted the death of thought for the death of people. And what that also means is that because we can transmute our thought and change it abstractly, we can change the manner in which we act radically enough so we're not subject to Malthusian limitations. We can get more from less all the time. You know, like we're way more effective at propelling automobiles using gasoline than we were 40 years ago. Way more efficient, way less pollution. We can get oil out of shale, and we couldn't do that at all 20 years ago. And we're getting Exxon announced, I think 3 weeks ago, that they'd figured out a way, I can't remember if it was to double oil shale production or to double the amount of oil they could get out of exhausted oil reservoirs. Wow. So our vision at ARC is essentially this, is that there isn't a more valuable natural resource than human cognitive capacity.
Okay.
And there's 8 billion of us, and that means there's 8,000 people out there now who are 1 in a million. Like, if we could capitalize on our collective intelligence, there's no limit to the number of problems we could solve. I don't think there's any reason at all to assume that we couldn't have the abundant future that we would all dream of and maintain harmony with the environment in a manner that we would deem acceptable indefinitely. And I think the best way to interfere with that, both of those, the economic part of it and the environmental part, is to terrify people into tyrannical submission, to demolish the poor, because that will happen immediately afterward, and to have the whole goddamn house of cards come tumbling down. We don't need to do that. So here's another fact.
When you say demolish the poor, what do you mean?
Well, if you make energy more expensive, well, who do you hurt?
Poor people.
Well, obviously, and every time you make any basic necessity, and there's no basic necessity more basic than energy.
Yeah.
As soon as you make that more expensive, you hurt the poor.
Yeah.
And you know, it's always the case, there's a pyramid of poor people, of wealth. There's a small number of people at the top, and they have most of the wealth. And then you go all the way down to the bottom where most of the people are, and they're barely bloody well holding on. And so if you add any more stress to the system, you knock a bunch of them off. They're no longer able to hold to the side of the cliff, and they just fall down. And you know, the Malthusian types will say, well, there's too many people on the planet anyways. And I always read that as saying, well, that means you'll sacrifice the poor to the planet because that's your bloody plan. And I think that is absolutely 100% unconscionable. We should be working to drive energy costs down as low as possible. And getting the Indians and the Chinese, the Africans, getting their standard of living up. This is cool too. So if you get people to the point where their income exceeds $5,000 a year per capita, they start taking a long-term view of the future and worrying about environmental concerns locally. So while you imagine you're scrabbling around in the damn dirt, like literally trying to worry about where your next meal is going to come from, you're not really very concerned about environmental maintenance over the next 3 generations.
Yeah, you can't.
Well, obviously. But as soon as you have enough money so that you're not terrorized by poverty, and so that you can start thinking about the future, immediately you start caring about your local environment. And so what that means, I realized this about 15 years ago, it actually means that the fastest way forward to true environmental sustainability is to eradicate absolute poverty. So we could have our cake and eat it too. And that's the sort of thing that I think is an invitation, is imagine the future is we eradicate poverty and everything's greener. Well, that's a much better deal than degrowth. You know, you don't have heat in your house, you don't get air conditioning, you don't get to fly, you don't get to have a car, you don't get to crack a joke. You know, you're a bloody curse on the surface of the planet. There should be a lot less of you. It's evil to have children. Your ambition is nothing but part of the bloody patriarchal nightmare. It's like, I don't like that vision. And I think it will bring about the very catastrophe that it's hypothetically designed to mitigate against. And what I would like instead is to offer people a vision where people listen and they say, Jesus, you know, I could get on board with that. I could devote myself to that. That sounds like the kind of future I'd like to have voluntarily, right?